Three-time Swedish Nationals winner Herman Hansen has played hundreds of games of YuGiOh this weekend. The date is March 23rd, 2025, and there are about 8 hours left in this month's Duelist Cup. Hansen's in the running for the first place in the tournament, which would win him a ticket to the World Championships. He loses the coin flip against a player with a name that translates to "What are you doing for your future?", who I will refer to as Shorai, and in classic Master Duel fashion, Hansen only opens a singular hand trap, Nibiru, the primal being. The situation is dire. Within a couple of plays, his opponent is threatening to make Appaloosa before continuing their Snake Eye Fiendsmith combo, functionally eating Nibiru for breakfast. Now is his last shot to activate it. At this moment, Hansen is in an almost unwinnable position, and he's about to play one of the best games of his life. Hansen makes the call to not use Nibiru here. He doesn't even take time to think about it, instead letting Shorai continue uninterrupted for the duration of their combo. Snake Eye Fiendsmith is strong for two main reasons: the redundancy of its playmakers and the power of its endboards. Let's quickly take a look at what Shorai has access to at the end of the turn. 3 monster negates in Appaloosa, a targeted permanent Omni negate in Sinful Spoils of Betrayal, 2 banishes off of the SP Little Knight waiting to be summoned off of the Masquerena lurking in the spell trap zone, a targeted monster negate with their set copy of Infinite Impermanence, 2 forms of battle protection in co-linked Nightmare Phoenix and Linkaribo, a monster pop in the form of Promethean Princess, and follow-up plays on their next turn from the Fiendsmith engine and Snake Eye's Flameburst Dragon. All of this must be cleared with the Nibiru that he has made the conscious decision to not use, and the now 5 engine cards that he draws into for turn. But as bleak as it looks, all hope is not lost. Hansen has one very significant advantage here: information. YuGiOh is a game of information. Hansen knows all but 2 of Shorai's cards, the unknowns being a card in the hand and a mystery imperm lurking in the spell trap zone. In contrast, Shorai has almost no knowledge of Hansen's hand, other than the fact that he has used no hand traps on the previous turn. This could suggest that the hand is full of starters and extenders, bricky engine requirements, or even board breakers. Hansen opens with a copy of Kashtira Unicorn and Snake Eye Ash, powerful yet vulnerable cards that all but guarantee he is not saving multiple breakers in his grip to loosen up the board first. Weak pushes like this are a sign of desperation. After summoning Black Witch, which burns through the second Appaloosa negate and the Imperm, Hansen charges into battle. He intends to destroy his opponent's Black Witch for 3 main purposes. 1. It ensures Shorai's survival, permitting them to think more about follow-up instead of just disruption. 2. It demonstrates to Shorai that Hansen might be threatened by Sinful Spoils of Betrayal. Betrayal requires Black Witch on board to be able to use, and Hansen might be trying to trade his battle phase for it. 3. Destroying Black Witch by battle gives Shorai the opportunity to trigger its Grave effect and tribute Snake Eye Flameburst Dragon, which enables follow-up for Shorai in the 5 summons necessary to activate Nibiru. Shorai takes the bait, and as a result gets their last Appaloosa negate blown out by the rock. Each remaining piece of the board is systematically picked apart in Hansen's ensuing combo. Engraver sends the Nib token, Little Knight banishes the Flameburst Dragon, and Masquerena makes Underworld Goddess to check any follow-up plays involving Promethean Princess. Hansen earns his 1000 DP, saves the replay, and continues his climb. The outcome of this game ultimately does not amount to much, but it doesn't mean the contents don't. After I watched it for the first time, a question that I commonly ask myself when reviewing close games came to mind. What is the most pivotal moment here? It's definitely subjective, but I don't think this is the pivotal moment of the game. I don't even think it's here. I think Hansen wins because right here he decides to do nothing at all. Hansen wins the game because he does not press this button. Ever. If Hansen pressed this button on his opponent's turn for even the smallest amount of time, the game would be over, and here's why. Throughout the course of this game, after this exact moment, Nibiru is a card that probably does not enter Shorai's mind. I asked Hansen about this game in Twitter DMs, and here is what he speculated about it.
I recognized he had enough bodies to go for the early Appaloosa, so playing the Nibiru in his turn wouldn't trade for anything on his end board. It was therefore safer to keep it and try to force him to summon 5 in my turn. It's really rare for a Nibiru to be played like this. Nibiru in Master Duel is already quite uncommon, at least on higher rank.
Hansen is right. In the collection of top 100 lists on Master Duel meta, it's only featured in 25 of the 82 decks. It wasn't the most standard card this tournament, and often those that played it only packed 1 or 2 copies. He's also correct that the way it gets used is weird. If you draw a Nibiru, the common times to use it would be when a card that can negate it like Appaloosa is being threatened, or at the end of the main phase if paired with another card like Infinite Impermanence or Effect Failure. Holding it past the first turn is an almost guarantee that it will never hit the field. However, you don't necessarily have to use Nibiru to reveal that you have it. In order to respond to your opponent's effects in a game of Master Duel, you must have a card you can activate and set your toggle to on. A toggle is a switch that, when turned on, lets the game know you would like to be offered the opportunity to activate a card effect. Sometimes people want the game to stop them every time they have the opportunity to use something so that they can think about whether they would want to use one of their cards, always keeping the switch on. However, this gives the opponent free information. After all, you're only going to get stopped if you have a card that meets its activation conditions, which makes it easy for the opponent to narrow down what card you might have. This information revealed by toggling is something Hansen is very aware of when playing Master Duel.
I never show my toggles in the game unless I misclick. In my opinion, half the MD game is playing with toggles, making your opponent think you have something you don't, or making them unaware of the things you do have. He of course did not know I had the Nibiru toggle.
For Hansen's plan to work, he has to hide his Nibiru, otherwise his opponent has access to some of the easiest counterplay in the world, a true classic that even old heads will remember. Just don't summon 5 times on your opponent's turn. Hansen even comments on it.
He could have played around it by just not sending his Flamberge, but he likely didn't even have Nib in mind.
If even the tiniest drop of priority had been passed to Hansen at any time during the main phase of the first turn, Shorai would consider the threat of Nibiru, and then there would be no way Hansen could possibly win. But YuGiOh is a game of information, and Hansen held all the cards, so in this game, he navigated the line to victory. I'd like to talk a bit about information in YuGiOh because it's incredibly important. The ways good players acquire, conceal, and reveal information are crucial skills that separate them from the rest. The first time I was made aware of how crucial information could be came with the death of Mind Crush. If you're an old head that remembers not summoning 5 times on your opponent's turn, it's possible you remember this card being used in a slew of side decks up until around 2019. It even spent some time on the limited list. By modern standards, you might even feel like this makes sense. The effect is similar to banned cards like a Pointer of the Red Lotus and Smoke Grenade of the Thief, Confiscation, and the Forceful Sentry. Hell, even Talents is limited these days. Unlike these cards, Mind Crush is at 3 and sees no play in YuGiOh's advanced format. This is by design in a very literal sense. In 2019, there was a rule change that removed the need for the opponent to verify that certain effects involving areas of private information had been resolved correctly. Back in the day, after you activated Mind Crush, you could verify the hand of your opponent to make sure they weren't hiding any copies of the card you called. This gave the card some additional utility. If you activated Mind Crush, regardless of whether or not you called a card in your opponent's hand correctly, you gained full knowledge of what they had to work with and could structure the rest of the duel accordingly. This aspect of the card is built into cards like a Pointer and Smoke Grenade, and ended up being the deciding factor in Mind Crush's viability, which immediately plummeted. But why is this information so important? You're still playing with the same cards, right? In other card games, effects like this can exist without too much of an issue. Thoughtseize in Magic is a card that is so well known that I've learned about it through Osmosis, and I boot up Arena like once a year on average. One of YuGiOh's defining traits in contrast to other games is its speed, and in most games the contents of your opening hand will define much of what happens in the game. Therefore, getting to peek at your opponent's hand and take a card is one of the strongest effects you can have, because of the taking, but also because of the peeking. Now, aside from a few very recent exceptions, it is true that most of these choose something to hand loop cards aren't available in the format and haven't been for a while. If you're not a water aficionado, the process of gathering information is a lot less straightforward than just looking at your opponent's hand, and is divided into a couple different kinds of things. It's worth noting that not all of this information is completely reliable. Very little in YuGiOh is completely reliable, but that does not mean that the information is useless. The first type of information is what you can learn from the game state. This is the basic stuff and encompasses a wide variety of facts that you can gather just from paying attention to the game, and it's here because it's by far the most reliable. One of the reasons tournament players often ask about the number of cards in hand is because it gives them a sense of the amount remaining they need to play through, which helps them decide how to make use of their resources or interruptions. For example, let's say I'm playing a game and my opponent has no cards in hand. I know for a fact I do not have to think about Nibiru, because I can see that they have nothing, and therefore there is no possibility of it being activated. The second type is what you can deduce from your opponent's actions within the game. For example, let's say my opponent link summons a spirit with Eyes of Blue on their turn, opting not to activate the effect to search a mausoleum of white. While there might be reasons to do this to play around certain cards, a common reason is that they might not have a search target. Because of this, you might deduce that they have all their copies of Mausoleum in their opening hand, or are not playing the card. The third type is what you can guess at from your knowledge of standard deck lists. YuGiOh has common patterns in deck building and gameplay, and you can use these to assume things about what your opponent might have. For example, if my opponent playing Blue Eyes has a set card, I might assume it's something like Infinite Impermanence, Majesty of the White Dragons, True Light, Dominus Purge, Called by the Grave, or Primite Drillbeam. I probably wouldn't assume it's something like House of Adhesive Tape. Despite the fact that the card is at 3 compared to Called by at 1, I am not sure anyone has ever put a copy of House of Adhesive Tape in a card sleeve, so it does not make sense to play around it. I might also assume that the set is more likely to be a card like Imperm or Purge compared to Majesty or True Light, because of standard ratios the cards are played at. These assumptions should change based on the type of person you're playing against. If your Blue Eyes opponent is X4 at a local and is playing without a mat, you might decide that taking extra effort to destroy a set trap before going to the battle phase is a good idea on the chance it's a creative choice. Knowledge of standard deck lists can't always inform you of cards played by creative deck builders at the bottom tables, but creative deck builders also play at the top tables with unexpected techs meticulously chosen to beat the standard stuff through hours of testing. This doesn't mean that making assumptions is bad either. YuGiOh has so many cards in the pool that you can't possibly play around everything. It's better to account for the types of cards you think your opponent is likely to play, and shift your expectations when playing against different opponents. The fourth type, which might be controversial, is what you can gather from your opponent outside of the game. If you've been scouting during a tournament, you might even know your opponent's list card for card. You can look at this video of mine if you want more information on that. This category also includes a variety of tricks, traps, reads, and tells that can honestly be so complex that they might warrant their own video later, or a 400-page book if your name is Patrick Hoban. It is important to note that the farther away you get from what you can see, the less dependable the information tends to be. Shorai lost based on this deduction. If my opponent opened Nibiru, they would have used it during the first turn. Nibiru is also not the most commonly played card, so it isn't likely that my opponent drew into it for turn. Hansen never presented any information to contradict this assumption until he literally activated Nibiru on the second turn. In YuGiOh, this kind of play is often called a slow roll, where you activate a card later than expected so that your opponent can't play around it. It's one of the ways you can use less reliable information against your opponent to get them to do what you want. The other, far more famous way to do this is called bluffing. Bluffing is not a new concept or unique to YuGiOh. People have probably been doing it for as far back as there have been games with hidden information, the most notable being War.
父亲，何故退兵？
你不知，诸葛向来用兵谨慎，不曾弄险。如今城门大开，不见兵将，城中必有埋伏。再者，诸葛亮琴声诱寒杀机， 我兵若进城，必中其计。快撤！撤！撤！快撤！
A close second, however, would be poker. Poker honestly shares a lot of similarities with Yu-Gi-Oh! As far as the importance of information goes, since both games require you to structure your plays around guesses at what the opponent has hidden from you. Even a lot of the vocabulary is shared. Words like tilt, bricks, drawing the nuts, angle shooting, and bubbling are used in both games, though Yu-Gi-Oh! Has bluffing in its roots as far back as the tip cards included in its first ever reprint set. Poker is practically synonymous with it. In poker, not ever bluffing is actively detrimental to the results of a well-rounded player. In Hall of Fame player Doyle Brunson's Poker Strategy Classic Super System, he writes,
"If you've never had the opportunity to see a real no-limit game, you'd be very surprised how much bluffing there is. Good no-limit players bluff 4 or 5 times as often as good players in limit games. Bluffing in no limit requires real strategy and the ability to size up your opponents every time you sit down to play."
Bluffing in poker is a great equalizer. It is both a tool used by aggressive and advantaged players to bully out their competition, and the origin of the phrase any two, referring to the fact that even the lowest 2 cards might be able to win a poker hand through bluffing. As a result, a significant amount of time and effort has gone into writing theory about bluffing and reading players. One of the main takeaways is this: for a bluff to be effective, it needs a story to tell.
That's another thing that distinguishes Hold'em from other games, except for the now nearly dead game of 5-card stud. It's very easy to see when you have the nuts, or very close to it. You can use that fact to great advantage in Hold'em because you can represent or bluff when you don't have the nuts, and when you're quite certain your opponent doesn't have them either.
Bluffing has to present a credible threat, and in poker that credible threat comes from a postured phantom of an unbeatable hand, the nuts. If the flop comes down with a 10, a jack, and a queen, and the player starts shoving chips in the center, it doesn't take a genius to start to fear the straight. The shared cards in poker dictate the possibility of these strong potential hands. And if a player makes the read that the others at the table are hesitant to commit to the pot, a bluff might be all it takes to earn free money with garbage cards. This is a gross oversimplification, of course. As with most well-designed games, any action in poker has a good deal of options for counterplay. Without the story, though, bluffing inherently doesn't make sense and becomes ineffective. This is something that transcends poker and applies to all bluffs. Let's take a look at an example of a bluff at an extremely high-profile premiere event, my locals in February of 2024, and break it down into some of the critical pieces. At this tournament, I was playing Branded, and my opponent was playing Tri-Brigade Lyrilisc. This was the first time my opponent and I had played, so we didn't have any prior knowledge of each other's deck lists. I lose the die roll and am forced to go second in Game 1. My opponent combos into a board of Utopic Draco Future, Appaloosa with 4 negates, and a 5-material Ensemble Robin with 2 unknown cards in hand. I opened Super Poly, a copy of Bestial Lubellion, and 3 engine cards that I didn't think to write in my Discord message to my friends after the tournament ended. Utopic Draco Future, often called UDF, is not the easiest card to out with Branded. It can't be destroyed by battle or card effects, meaning that there are 2 main ways to get rid of it: the Banish effect of Mirror Jade, or the On-Summon effect of Fallen of Albaz to use UDF as fusion material. This is made more complicated by the fact that UDF can negate a monster effect once a turn, meaning that it inherently resists its own outs. Going into my turn, UDF is what I am most concerned over, since Ensemble Robin and Appaloosa are easily answerable by my Super Poly. I start the turn by doing just this, and Super Poly the monsters into a Muddragon of the Swamp. My next step is to activate its effect. Muddragon has the ability to change its attribute, preventing your opponent from targeting monsters of that attribute. In a regular Branded deck, the right choice for this would probably be Dark, since it can protect many of the important dark cards in your deck like Albaz, Kit, Aluber, Albion, and Mirror Jade from your opponent's effects. Instead, I choose Light. Here is where I start writing the story of my bluff, because I'm depending on my opponent piecing together why I might go out of my way to activate Muddragon at all, and why I chose that attribute in particular. My next play is to activate the Bestial Lubellion, which resolves and allows me to add a copy of Bestial Magnamut from my deck to my hand. I activate my Magnamut and target the Lubellion in my grave, and my opponent is forced to think about what I might be doing. None of my actions are a direct threat to UDF, but they convey a couple of things for my opponent to deduce. 1. I am not planning to summon the Bestial Lubellion in my grave, since if Magnamut resolves it will be banished. 2. By banishing Lubellion, I am paying a significant opportunity cost to put Magnamut on the board. I must not have anything better to banish, and putting it on the field must enable some kind of important play involving Magnamut. 3. I have chosen to make my Mud Dragon light, meaning that Magnamut being summoned will leave me with a level 4 light and a level 6 dark monster. My opponent makes sense of the story and understands the bluff. I am threatening to synchro summon a Chaos Angel with both a light and a dark monster. This Chaos Angel would be unaffected by activated monster effects, unable to be destroyed by battle, and would be able to banish UDF on summon. This would result in me winning the game because my opponent's deck probably did not have any outs to it if it gets summoned. It's even partially supported by my opponent's knowledge of standard lists. Bestial engines are common choices in synchro decks like Centurion, or even certain builds of Branded. There's just one problem. I don't own a copy of Chaos Angel. Branded's most powerful card, Branded Fusion, locks you into fusion monsters for the duration of the turn, which means that summoning anything else besides fusions is a huge problem. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game of information. Because my opponent had never played me before, my story of Chaos Angel makes enough sense, and it presents a threat that he thinks is too dangerous to allow. He uses the UDF to negate Magnamut's summoning effect, which lets me out it cleanly with Mirror Jade later in the turn and win the game. By thinking about the story you're telling through the way you choose to play, you can bluff cards that aren't even in your deck. This is part of what is so important about managing what information you're showing your opponent. Let's say I had discarded a copy of everyone's favorite banned card,
Gimmick Puppet Nightmare,
to activate Super Polymerization. Nightmare was only played in branded builds that played Branded Fusion, so just the act of revealing I have a Nightmare in my deck would have given my opponent enough information to conclude that Magnamut being summoned was not worth negating. This is entirely due to the order in which I reveal my cards. A question you might ask is this: was my opponent's choice to negate Magnamut correct? If you are in my opponent's position, should you call the bluff? This situation is admittedly tough for them. Losing their two main pieces of interaction to Super Poly probably made it difficult to win regardless, but I think it's worth exploring these kinds of situations to know what to think about when they happen to you. In a 2018 Reddit post, Oscar from MST TV explores bluffing in Yu-Gi-Oh! He goes over a couple of different kinds of bluffs in the post, of varying legality, but he proposes a way of looking at potential bluffs to determine when it's good to do them and when it's good to call them. Bluffing in general often ends up requiring a player to play suboptimally in some way in order to make the bluff convincing. In my example of bluffing in Branded, I intentionally had to avoid discarding cards for Super Polymerization that might be better in the graveyard, like the Puppet or Despian Tragedy, because they gave up information that contradicts the bluff. I couldn't make Mud Dragon dark to protect my important dark monsters, and I could have even ended up banishing my one copy of Bestial Lubellion. Even classics, like setting a normal spell as a bluff, take a card from your hand where it is safer and put it on the field where it could be destroyed for no benefit, or cause other problems. Like in poker, bluffing usually involves you taking some level of risk that could pay off if your opponent behaves in the way that you want them to. Not all bluffs are risky though. Letting your opponent know that you need a moment to think after their 5th summon has no in-game cost and is completely legal if you don't take too long, but might route them into a weaker board that plays better into Nibiru when you don't have it. There are also times when your position is so bad that any amount of risk is acceptable for a bluff that could get you back in the game. In this video, Jesse Cotton highlights a theoretical bluff in Labyrinth from the finals of YCS Raleigh in 2024. In this situation, Jack Zhou, who is on Labyrinth, is in a losing position against Cameron Neal on Snake Eye. Zhou has a backjack engrave that can only pull a useless duplicate Big Welcome from his deck that his opponent is unaware of, and a Nibiru in hand. Zhou has the opportunity to use backjack to bait Appaloosa and then activate Nibiru as Chainlink 3, very similar to how Hansen activated his Nibiru earlier. Deciding to try to use backjack in this way costs Zhou nothing, because just like Hansen, he is quite literally dead if he activates Nibiru before Appaloosa just from the sinful spoils he knows Neal has set. There is no risk to worry about here, because using backjack as a bluff represents the only potential path to victory for Zhou in this game. Riskier bluffs with large rewards become better and better options the farther behind you are in a game, to the point where taking one isn't really a risk at all. But what if you are significantly ahead? In these scenarios, gambling on a play with risk that could lose you your position is not advisable, so there is usually little reason to bluff. YuGiOh is not like poker in this respect, because there is no variable amount of money to be gained from tricking your opponent. You can only win or lose, so when you are in a very good position, you should be primarily concerned with maintaining it. By that logic, if you are significantly behind, it is often better to assume your opponent is not bluffing in these scenarios, because there is not really a need for them to put themselves at risk when they have a way to win anyways. On the flip side though, if you're significantly ahead, it's often better to call someone's bluff. If you're Anil here playing Snake Eye into the theoretical bluff, you might question the reason for Zhou not using backjack before Appaloosa gets made. You would be right to do so, since it opens you up to losing to cards like Nibiru and Ghost Ogre. This can get pretty complicated when applied to real games, so it's worth noting that every situation is unique. There's no one-size-fits-all theory for when it comes to calling potential bluffs. With our newfound knowledge, let's take a look at one of the most famous bluffs of all time, the finals of YCS Pasadena in 2022. This match is exceptional, with tons of back and forth, passion, and excitement between Hani Jawari and Jesse Cotton. Most importantly though, this match is awesome because it's a tier mirror. Being a tier mirror, the situation the players find themselves in is pretty complicated, so we'll only be covering a few ideas around it. You can find Jesse's video on it linked in the description if you're part of the 99.9% he's referring to in this message to me and want a more in-depth breakdown. The stakes of this game were high. Hani was looking for his first YCS win as a solo player, and Jesse had taken 4th place and 2nd place finishes with tier elements at the last 2 YCSs he attended, and sought to seal the deal. Both players take a game off of each other, bringing them into a game 3. Hani goes first, and mills a lot of cards off of the normal summon Diviner to send a YuGiOh. Both players hit copies of Keldo and Medora, Injin, and Jesse searches a copy of Tearlament's Crime off of Scream. After a couple of chains, Jesse is able to disrupt his opponent by making a Kaleido Heart to shuffle back Hani's Kit Kalos. Hani in turn is able to slap together an Abyss Dweller and seizes board control by using triple tactic talents to steal Jesse's Mud Dragon, which he uses to make a Baron de Fleur to destroy the Kaleido Heart. 7 of the cards mentioned so far are now on the Forbidden and Limited list. Jesse is locked from using his grave and spends his next couple of turns baiting out the Baron Negate, developing his Shufflers, and outing the Abyss Dweller. Hani shuffles it back and remakes it, searching a Soliak in the process. Jesse is able to cling to life by forcing Hani to waste his battle phase to out Crime turn 2 and a Shuffler turn 4, and he is then able to use a Bestial to finally attempt to win back board control from Hani. Jesse's attack here puts the players in this very interesting position. The threat of the still unused Crime with Merle on the field looms over Hani, cutting him off of many potential lines. If Hani lets the attack go through, he will lose his Rhino Heart, so he opts to use it to bluff. By flipping Soliak, Hani threatens to send Rhino Heart to grave and use its grave effect, requiring a discard of a Tearlaments card in his hand. This could get his engine going and put him in the driver's seat for the rest of the match. But Hani doesn't have a Tearlaments card in his hand. His only card is a Magnamut. Jesse neglects to call the bluff, negating the Soliak with his copy of Crime, which leads to him losing the game to Hani's Bestial.
That's it. Ruby summon, through his worm, affects it, and Hani defeats the top and YCS Pasadena champion.
When this game aired, and in some of the subsequent live streams and videos that covered it, certain critics casted Jesse's decision to negate Soliak as a mistake, him not recognizing Hani's bluff for what it is. In reality though, it's not so simple. For starters, there are only a couple of cards that Hani could have in hand that could even make sense here. Scream, Rhino, Merle, and Havness would probably have been used differently. You might even ask why Hani needs to bait out Crime with a bluff in the first place. Because Crime requires a tier monster on the field to be used, it's a very fragile disruption here. If Jesse makes any sort of link play to get his engine rolling, Merle is gone and Crime turns off. If Hani has a monster with a moderate amount of attack on board, like the Abyss Dweller he has already, he can attack over Merle and crime turns off.
So I think he assumes the card in my hand is not doing anything. So if he just does nothing here, and I kill his Rhinoheart, and I have Merle Sarnir in the field, if I pass back, he just goes draw, Dweller attack Merle, reveal Magnamut, make a Charmer of his own, search another Bestial in the end phase as well, and I have to, I don't have a Shuffler in my grave anymore because it's in my hand still, the Keldo, and it's just way worse. And I no longer have follow up now because my one tier in play and 1 level 2 is gone.
Hani doesn't need to bluff here because Jesse's position is honestly horrible, and Hani can get himself into an advantageous position without any gambling. By bluffing with Soliak, Hani opens himself up to an unneeded chance to lose if Jesse lets the Soliak go through and redeclares his attack to destroy Abyss Dweller. Jesse accepts the bluff not necessarily because Hani's story is convincing, but because he sees how little value crime has in the current position. Getting his Shuffler into the graveyard and getting rid of Soliak could help him in the top decking war in a way crime just won't. It's a judgment made to maximize value and give himself the best odds of winning based on the information he has available to him, so calling it a mistake is a little short-sighted. There are many scenarios where bluffing isn't a good idea, and if Jesse had come to a different conclusion here, Hani had the chance of losing a game that was pretty close to locked up. As the juices of potential bluffs ferment in the minds of all of you who have made it this far, I wanted to finish this essay going over some of the rules around bluffing. I have no doubt my audience is composed of strong and experienced players, so I'm sure you've taken the time to read Yu-Gi-Oh's tournament policy documents at some point. But on the off chance you need a refresher, I'll go over a few key lines in the misrepresenting the game state section, and list a corresponding bluff or trick that is made illegal with them. You'll find that many of these rules do not look favorably on intentional bluffs that take place outside the confines of the game, which is a reason why I've not opted to go over stuff like tells, reads, and ways to get information outside of the game in this video. With that in mind, let's take a look at our first rule.
Duelists may not perform actions that would intentionally mislead their opponent or a tournament official about the game state.
Some of you might remember the controversy around Andre Torres getting suspended for intentionally attempting to mislead his opponents through the use of a Sword Soul token.
Just some tokens, you put these on top, they think that you're playing with Sword Soul.
Anyone can use Sword Soul tokens at a tournament. This is illegal because of Andre's intent to deceive. Proving intent can turn your area very gray very quickly, so you should be careful about making comments about ways you chose to influence your opponent outside the game. Let's take a look at another line.
Duelists may not answer questions or offer information about game state information that is considered private knowledge.
This prevents one of the most basic bluffs you can make outside the game, just telling your opponent you have a given card. Even if it was legal, I don't think it's generally good to make these kinds of bluffs against experienced players in the first place. If anything, tricks like these are a sign of weakness. If you actually had an impactful card, it would make sense to try and hide it the way that Hansen does against Shorai, instead of forcing your opponent to take it into account. Now, another rule.
Duelists may not make false statements about the game or gameplay, even about information that is considered private knowledge.
This rule encompasses a number of ways you could lie and bluff, but one of them is telling your opponent you have lethal when you don't in order to get them to scoop. Don't do this! Even when Oscar posted this, it was illegal, and the rule is much less lenient about intent here should a judge be called over. Let's take a look at our last one.
Duelists may not make deceptive offers to or agreements with their opponents.
While this is probably getting pretty far from a bluff at this point, a classic example of this that took place in the ancient year of 2015 would be Jingate. Hoban making an agreement with his opponent to side out the hated Jin releaser of rituals during an ARG in Necros format, only to side in a second copy. While this agreement was maybe true to the letter of what he said, this is obviously intentional deception and not allowed in Konami-sanctioned events. As you learn more and more techniques to help sell your bluffs, and there are many that I did not cover, make sure to verify whether or not what you are doing is allowed. In my opinion, two of the most important parts of competing are your sportsmanship as a competitor and your adherence to the game's rules. Once you stray beyond that, you undermine the important infrastructure that allows card games to be fun and competitive. With that, I am out of characters, so I guess this is the end. This has been my longest video so far, and I think it's both benefited and suffered from the research I've put into it. Many thanks to Sunny, Mark the Page, and Thempire Ian for reading quotes for this video. I've linked their channels in the description. Also, a massive thanks to my patrons. Support on Patreon is what makes putting together videos like this much more justifiable for me. So if you want to help my work beyond just a like or subscription, which I also really appreciate, you know where to go. Be well until next time.
Okay, so that's the straight-laced ones. Let's do some silly ones. Duelists may not perform actions that would intentionally mislead their opponent or a tournament official about the game state. And then let's get a nerdy one going. Duelists may not perform actions that would intentionally mislead their opponents or a tournament official about the game state.